over the last many days about the India-China standoff from the angle of how can India truly be Atmanirbhar, reduce its dependence on China and make sure that the economic gun is not pointed to our heads. Well, frankly, that is the only way to go, and we've been speaking to a series of people in this regard. Today, I'm pleased to welcome on the show Rathin Roy, top economist and of course currently director at NIPFP. Rathin, great to speak to you once again, and at a time when so much of the discussion across the board, and quite happy about that, is focused on the economy. Let me start with the concept of being Atmanirbhar in the context of the India-China standoff. Do you think that's the right direction we're headed in?
We are not headed in that direction, but it is the right direction to head in. I have been saying for some time that all this fanciful talk about India exporting will not happen unless India is able to demonstrate that it can sell to its population at affordable prices. And if you look around this room I'm sitting in, or you look around your TV studio or your home, wherever you are, I can promise you that 25% of very basic stuff, light fittings, fan switches, wires, sewing needles, are imported from other countries, principally China. Why? Because we are unable to make them at affordable prices. So I've been saying that the way for India to become a major exporter is to first produce for our own people at affordable prices. When we make 3,000 rupee shirts, such as the one I'm wearing, we make them in India. When we make 400 rupee shirts, we buy them from Bangladesh, Vietnam, and China. Why? Is it the case that I can make shirts for the rich, but not shirts for the poor? So in that context, I think Atmanirbharta interpreted that way is a very wise counsel, but the roadmap to do that is not consonant with big talk about export powerhouses or the current fast-moving indicators of the Indian economy. Bottom line, people earning the minimum wage are demanding a bunch of stuff. They're buying them. But they're not buying them from Indian entrepreneurs, they're buying them from Chinese and Vietnamese and Bangladeshi entrepreneurs because our ecosystem is not able to produce them cheaply enough. If you're going to have to do that, you're going to have to change the output composition of the Indian economy. There is an opportunity to do so post-COVID, and we should take it with both hands and roll. Then, and only then, will we be truly self-reliant. Other than that, I would say, you could consider why India is the largest importer of defense equipment in the world and why the needle on that has moved so slowly. You could consider why India's energy efficiency systems are such that we do not, or I would advocate not buying, renewable solar panels from China because energy is a national security issue, which means that we have to spend more on buying solar panels, which means energy becomes more expensive unless we can compete with China and produce solar panels at as lower cost as they do. So the problem is very simple. We need to become more productive and more efficient and sell to the people earning the minimum wage and above, not just to the rich. Then we will be Atmanirbhar, and then other countries will look twice at us before thinking of provoking us.
Rathin, this is a refrain that I hear very often, and a very simple question that I'm asking you. We are today expecting Indian industry to perfect and compete with what China has been doing for the last 3 to 4 decades. And this is a question not just in India but across the world, which has gone and sworn by the mantra of globalization, where you import the cheapest and best depending on where it's available, to now reverse and say, let's become self-reliant and let's make everything ourselves.
Yes, I think you are right that is not going to happen unless you make at least one of the two following policy choices. So today let me ask you, what am I importing from China? I'm not importing food from China. I'm importing 400 rupee shirts from China. That's a problem. I'm not importing affordable housing from China. I'm not importing good healthcare from China. I'm not importing good education from China. I'm not importing water and sanitation from China. But these things have a very low share in our output composition. So one way you can become Atmanirbhar is you produce more of the things that you do not import that the common people of this country require. Pick and choose certain things that the common people are consuming, such as 400 rupee or 300 rupee shirts, and try and make up there in the medium term. And then you are able to better compete. So you can change the output composition and selectively become more productive in industries where you're not. With the current output composition of demand, this is simply not going to happen. So it's a very serious national security issue. It's a very serious economic security issue. It is, however, the good news is twofold. One, if we had anyway, China or no China, if we had kept on that road, as I've been arguing, we would have hit a lower middle income trap. COVID crisis has exacerbated our journey to that lower middle income trap, but it's also given us a chance to redraw the map. It's given the world a chance to pause and think about globalization. It has increased the costs of logistics, and therefore countries that are able to do more frugal logistics, produced in a more decentralized way, using the means at their disposal, and change their output composition of demand to produce the things that common people want. Those countries will gain in the scenario going forward. So that is how we need to have a reset in the way we think about economic policy, and that can be done, but that will involve sweeping structural changes, and we had better start yesterday.
So let's take a look at what we're doing right now vis-a-vis what happened in Galwan, just a few days ago. There is a diplomatic conversation which is going on. There is, of course, the preparations and the strategy which need to be put in place at the LAC on the ground. And there is a very clear understanding crystallizing now that the way we deal with China on the trade front has to be a part of the overall strategy. So we've seen these 100% checks on consignments coming from China, though the government has said clearly this is not a plan, this is maybe one-off according to some information. We know that there is a move to tighten the import on certain low-cost Chinese products. E-commerce sites are being nudged to display the country of origin so that patriotic Indians can make the choice of whether they want to boycott make in China goods, etc. Is all of this going to really lead to anything concrete, or is just symbolism which we need to do right now to give a stern message?
Unfortunately, our dependence on Chinese imports is much larger than their dependence on exports. But our share in their total imports is very small. So even if Indian imports went to zero, it wouldn't have anything other than an infra-marginal effect on the Chinese economy. See, amongst patriotism and all that, it is very important for people, especially in my position, to set out the facts to the people of India. It is all very well if you wish to be symbolic, but it's not going to solve your problem. It was important for solidarity to light candles and all that sort of thing when we imposed a lockdown, but that was not going to solve COVID. So I don't want to conflate the two. If people feel emotionally that they want to boycott Chinese goods, go ahead. But if you're asking me as an economist whether that will have an impact on Chinese economic fortunes, other than a signaling impact, the answer is no. So what could have an impact? What could have an impact is three things, and they're not mutually exclusive. One, every Indian must understand that if you are not going to buy Chinese, you are going to pay more for what you buy. Or you are going to do without. You will either not consume something if it is Chinese because you cannot afford to consume the more expensive rival's product.
So Rathin, that's an important point. That's an important point. That's an important point because this has been reiterated and echoed across the board. A union minister recently, not specifically saying Chinese, but said that, for some time, Indians should be willing to pay more for made in India products. My question is, why should Indians be willing to pay more? Why should Indians pay more? Do you think that there is a case to pay more for made in India right now unless the quality and price is the same?
That's a national decision. That's an individual decision. It becomes national if you actually ban cheaper imports, and then you will end up paying more. If you individually wish to only buy Indian, then you will pay more, and therefore your economy will become more expensive. But remember the macroeconomic impact of this, and as a nation, we have to be prepared to accept it. We are already staring at negative growth. it is inevitable that when you try and buy things from not from the least cost supplier, then, for example, in the case of intermediates, in the case of other things will become more expensive. When things become more expensive, then profit margins will be squeezed or demand will fall. If you build a house tomorrow and you stop buying the cheapest product that Chinese are providing in terms of wiring, light bulbs, light fittings, then the cost of that house will become more expensive, right? Or profit margins of that house builder will be squeezed, right? Both will have a negative impact on GDP, right? Is the country prepared to accept that? If it is, go ahead. But be very sure to understand there is no free lunch. If your patriotism extends to the extent that you're willing to settle for an even lower GDP than you were going to have in this crisis here, and if you are willing to settle and if you're willing to do without, then by all means let us do so. By all means let us do so. I myself argue that we should not be buying solar panels from China because energy is a national security issue. I've been arguing this for a while, I was ignored. Now all these newfound patriots are talking about, burning Chinese goods and all that. That is all symbolism that works as an RWA. We don't run grown-up economies that way. So if we want to have a strategy where we want to actively show that we do not wish to buy Chinese, we must accept the consequences. And that can be dealt with. But we must not fool ourselves that there will not be consequences.
Rathin, how do we ensure that this doesn't become just a talking point right now because of what has happened in Galwan? We saw, not to this extent, but we saw a similar sentiment come up during Dokulam. We tend to remember our dependence on the Chinese whenever they give us grief at the LAC or militarily or, in the context of Pakistan. But it's a problem we need to work at consistently with or without the Chinese in the picture.
I completely agree. In the end, if you're going to take on a superpower and going to take them on in a way that makes a material gain for your country in the long run, and this lesson I've learned from the Chinese, your economy will have to be much bigger relative to them. The relative difference between our economy and theirs today has never been higher in human history, well, at least since 1947. Yeah? So anything we do now will therefore involve sacrifice. Put it the other way. If the Chinese began boycotting Indian goods, it wouldn't make a bit of a difference to Chinese economy. Yeah? If the Chinese refuse to sell us goods, suppose they did that, we will not sell you, even if you want to buy. It will not make a bit of a difference to the Chinese economy. Therefore, if you're going to bring the economy into military and geopolitical statecraft, you must understand what your material decay, what your wherewithal is. And your wherewithal, I'm afraid, in this context is rather limited. And therefore, the only thing you can do is use extra economic means to negotiate and try and work as fast as possible to having a better economy. And that's a medium-term thing. Take opportunity of the COVID crisis. Take opportunity of the fact that the COVID crisis has made logistics an issue to start announcing what you're going to do with more frugal logistics and more decentralized production in your own country. In a sense, the problem we are facing with China is the same problem we are facing with migrant workers. Why are migrant workers migrating at great suffering up and down the country? Where today I have a situation I just learned in Bengal, where the same people who walk to Bengal are now being flown back by their employers because they don't have labor. This would not happen if the place of production of that migrant worker was close to that worker's place of migration. So that also reflects a problem with how our logistics has developed in response to our own economic model over the years. If we change that, we will fix the migrant worker problem. In the same way, if you change your attitude to logistics and your attitude to what you will produce, where you will produce it, you will go a long way towards solving the China problem. But that initiative has to be grasped with both hands because this COVID gives us a huge opportunity to do that. People are now wary of logistics chains that can be disrupted by pandemics such as this. Therefore, people will be more willing to look at prices in places where there are not such large logistics chains. And those if we can then make do with more frugal logistics, our value proposition will improve. So Indian industry has to start. Government is not going to be able to think in this level of sophistication. So I think Indian industry, Indian manufacturers need to get together and understand that this opportunity is there and they need to take advantage of it. The military matter and the symbolic matter, I'll leave to experts. I'm no expert on these matters.
Okay, let's get into this in a bit of detail. We often talk about the dependence on China in the context of electronics and APIs and these kind of spaces and sectors. Do we need to sort of draw up a priority list, or because we know we can't shut the tap on all imports immediately? But do you think there is merit in re-looking at what we are importing and what we can sort of cut out? The finance minister recently said that there is no real reason why we must import Ganesha idols, for example, from China. So do you think that that kind of an internal review is required right now?
You could do it, but you'll have to pay more. We're not importing Ganesha idols because they make them better in China or because we love them. We are doing it because we were unwilling to pay more for Ganesha idols. We destroyed the artisan industry here, and as a consequence, we are buying mass-produced items from China. So if you want to ban mass-produced items from China and produce Ganesha items here, you will have to pay more for them. You might get a better product because it's embedded in a cultural ethos. But you just have to stop, you'll have to pay more for them. It's as simple as that. If you're willing to pay more for them, it's fine. There's no question of that. The reason is very apparent why we are buying something from China, not because we love them, because it's cheaper. So you're not going to be able to overnight make things cheaper here, which is why you're buying Ganesha idols from them in the first place. A very common sense point. I don't understand why people are sort of pussyfooting around it. So you will have to buy things more expensively, as I've been saying. And if we want to do it as a nation, let's go ahead and do it. But be prepared to pay the cost. Now, to add to that, there is one issue, of course. There are some things that we simply do not produce in this country, solar panels, at least cost. But the second least cost producer is not Indian. It is possibly Japanese or German. So one thing we could do is turn to the countries producing second least cost and try and see if we can do deals with them where we narrow the difference between the least cost output coming from China and theirs. That in general is a good thing because our imports do need to diversify, and they have not been diversifying. And I've been worried for some time before the RWA started getting patriotic. I've been very worried about the fact that China is our largest import partner. I've written about it. Many economists have written about it. But now that the RWAs have woken up, and that seems to constitute public opinion nowadays, let us address that issue. Number one, they're our largest importer. We need to diversify. How do we do that? I've just given you a couple of suggestions. Number two, be prepared to pay more if you do not buy from China, unless you're able to find diversified sources for imports. Number three, in the medium term, try and become the least cost producer so that you don't have to import from anybody. Right? That's very straightforward. And long after the RWAs have avoided smashing their mobile phones, all of which are heavily Chinese, and smash their refrigerators that they claim come from China, etc., etc. Long after all this circus is over, this problem will remain unless we address it. And for me, what has happened in the border is a wake-up call that this needs to be addressed at priority by the government and the private sector, not by the RWAs.
Okay, one last question, Rathin. Often when we speak about China and India and how the two nations have, had a journey over the last 3 or 4 decades where China and India were in a similar position in the 80s, look what's happened today, etc. One part of the factor that is spoken about is that India is a thriving and mostly chaotic democracy, and China has not been one. China has rammed down its reforms, and that has led to a lot of the efficiencies it enjoys today and is a big component of the reason why they are the world's producers. Do you think that democracy, and with the kind of democracy we have and we're proud of, we can still go ahead and compete?
We're not trying to compete with China to become the world's producer, I hope. We're a long way from doing that, democracy or no democracy. Our per capita income is a fraction of China's. We are the poorest country in the G20. My aspiration for India is that we should make more for common Indians at prices which they can afford. And because they cannot afford, again I go back to those shirts, 400 rupee shirts, because we are not able to make them at affordable prices, we are buying from China. I want to be India's producer for India's people, for the common people of India, so that they are able to produce the things that they consume. Employment increases. That happens with frugal logistics so that mass migration does not happen. That is the kind of transformation we need to make. So much like the unemployment problem, the problem with China in terms of our dependency will be resolved simply by producing for Indians what they consume. And there, whether China is authoritarian or India is a democracy has nothing to do with it. The fact that India is a democracy or the kind of democracy India is, I don't think impacts the underlying reasons why productivity in India is low. Are you saying that, as anybody saying, not you, that because India is a democracy, industry is not setting up plant and equipment in UP and Bihar? Because India is a democracy, people are migrating 2,000 kilometers, creating expensive supply chains and logistics chains? Because India is a democracy, our R&D expenditure is the lowest in the world of any G20 country? Because India is a democracy, we are unable to institute SEZ, which then fail us, not because India is a democracy, because you suspend democracy in SEZ, but because it doesn't work for reasons other than we are a democracy and somebody else is a dictatorship. In fact, the worst thing you can do in this kind of situation is to impose rules upon people who have a will. The Chinese may have been able to do it with their own people. That is because the underlying causes of why people did things that they did were not rooted in certain business process failures. I regard mass migrant labor movement as a business process failure, for instance. And therefore, when we tried to inhibit that movement, people took agency to their own hands and moved. That had nothing to do with democracy. We tried our best to be anti-democratic with them. It did not work. And I'm proud of that and I'm happy about that. Then we moved to collaboration and cooperation. So in the same way, I think this democracy has to produce what people in this country can produce and consume for themselves, use that as a platform to export, and automatically our prosperity will go up with inclusivity, and that will make you a more robust and resilient economy and society than many other countries in the world. China can follow its own path. We have to follow our own. And I think that is the only way a genuine, self-confident nation should tread. You do not respond to what others say to you. You map your own destiny. And I think in this interview, what I've tried to tell you on the economic side is how we can do that mapping.
Absolutely. Why get mad when you can get even? And that is the path that India needs to follow. Thank you so much, Rathin, for speaking with us. It's always a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We'll take a very short break at this point, but we're not done with the China story yet. Remember all of those calls to only buy Indian and boycott made in China? Is it really translating and impacting sales of consumer durables and electronics? We get you a status check after this break.